The famous Scotch witch trial of 1590, when it was proved that upon the 31st of October in the preceding year, All Halloween, a gang of more than 200 persons had assembled for their rites at the old haunted church of North Berwick, where they consulted with their master, the devil, how they might most efficaciously kill King James is too well known to require more than a passing mention. But it may be remembered that Agnes Sampson confessed that she had endeavored to poison the king in various ways, and that she was also avowed that she had fashioned a wax mommet, saying with certain horrid maledictions as she wrought the work, "This is King James the Sixth, ordinate to be consumed at the instance of a nobleman Francis Earl of Bodwell." The contriver of this far-reaching conspiracy was indeed none other than Francis Stuart, the Earl of Bothwell, who, as common knowledge bruited, almost overtly aspired to the throne, and was perfectly reckless how he compassed his ends. It was he, no doubt, who figured as the devil at the meeting in the deserted and ill-omened kirkyard. In fact, this is almost conclusively shown by a statement of Barbara Napier when she was interrogated with regard to their objects in the attempted murder of the king. She gave as her reason that another might have ruled in his Majesty's place, and the government might have gone to the devil, that is to say, to Francis Bothwell. The birth of Prince Harry at Stirling on the 19th of February 1594, and further of Prince Charles at Dunfermline 19 November 1600, must have dashed all Bothwell's hopes to the ground. Moreover, the vast organization of revolutionaries and witches had been completely broken up, and accordingly there was nothing left for him to do but to seek safety in some distant land. There is an extremely significant reference to him in Sandys, who, speaking of Calabria in the year 1610, writes, "Here a certain Calabrian, hearing that I was an Englishman, came to me, and would needs persuade me that I had insight in magic. For the Earl Bothwell was my countryman, who lives at Naples, and is in these parts famous for suspected negromancy." In French history, even more notorious in the case of the Berwick witches, were the shocking scandals involving both poisoning and witchcraft that came to light and were being investigated in 1679 to 1682. At least 250 persons, of whom many were the representatives and scions of the highest houses in the land, were deeply implicated in these abominations. And it is no matter for surprise that a vast number of the reports and several entire dossiers and registers have completely disappeared. The central figures were the Abbé Guibourg and Catherine Deshays, more generally known as La Voisin, whose house in the Rue Beauregard was for years the rendezvous of a host of inquirers drawn from all classes of society, from palaces and prisons, from the lowest slums of the vilest underworld. That it was a huge and far-reaching political conspiracy is patent from the fact that the lives of Louis XIV, the Queen, the Dauphin, Louise de la Vallière, and the Duchess de Fontaine had been attempted secretly again and again, whilst as for Colbert, scores of his enemies were constantly entreating for some swift sure poison, constantly participating in unhallowed rites which might lay low the all-powerful minister. It soon came to light that Madame de Montespan and the Comtesse de Soissons were both deeply implicated. Whilst the Comtesse du Rouse and Madame de Polignac, in particular, coveting a lodging in the Bed Royal, had persistently sought to bring about the death of Louise de la Vallière. It is curious indeed to recognize the author of the rehearsal in this train, but there flits in and out among the witches and anarchists a figure who can almost certainly be identified with Georges Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. Yet this is the less surprising when we remember how very nearly he stirred up a mutiny, if not an insurrection, against the king, who had so particularly favored and honored him, but who, in the words of a contemporary, knew him to be capable of the blackest designs. Of Buckingham it has been written without exaggeration. As to his personal character, it is impossible to say anything in its vindication. For though his severest enemies acknowledge him to have possessed great vivacity and a quickness for parts peculiarly adapted to the purposes of ridicule, yet his warmest advocates have never attributed to him a single virtue. His generosity was profuseness, his wit malevolence, the gratification of his passions, his sole aim through life. When we consider the alliance of Buckingham with the infamous Shaftesbury, we need hardly wonder that whilst in Paris he frequented the haunts of this terrible society, and was present at, nay, even participated in the satanic mass and other of their horrible mysteries. At the house of La Voisin, necromancy was continually practiced. Poisons were brewed. The liturgy of hell was celebrated, and it was undoubtedly the hub of every crime and every infamy. Other instances, and not a few, might be quoted from French history to show how intimately politics were connected with witchcraft. Here, Madame de Montespan, aiming at the French throne, an ambition which involved the death of the Queen Maria Theresa of Austria, at once resorts to black magic and attempts to effect her purpose by aid of those who were infamous as past adepts in this horrid craft. Even in the Papal States themselves, such abominations were not unknown, and in 1633 Rome was alarmed and confounded by an attempt upon the life of Urban VIII. It seems that some charlatan had announced to Giacinto Santini, nephew of the Cardinal d'Ascoli, that his uncle would succeed the reigning pontiff in the chair of St. Peter. The rash and foolish young man promptly attempted to hasten the event, and did not hesitate to resort to certain professors of occult to inquire when the next conclave would take place. He was so incredibly foolish that, far from attempting any subterfuge or disguise, he seems to have resorted to the houses of astrologers and other persons who were already suspected of necromancy in the most open way, and further to have boasted among his intimates of the high honors which he expected his family would shortly enjoy. He first applied to one Fra Pietro, a Sicilian, who belonged to the order of the Augustinian eremites. This occultist told him that the Cardinal d'Ascoli would be elected at the next conclave, but that the present pope had many years to live. Upon seeing the young man's bitter disappointment, the cunning mage whispered that it was in his power to bring about the event much sooner than it would happen in the ordinary course of affairs. Needless to say, the proposition was taken up with alacrity, but it was necessary to employ the services of 2 other diviners, and they accordingly selected for the task Fra Cherumbino of Ancona, a Franciscan, and Fra Domenico of the Eremite monastery of San Agostino at Fermo. The friars then diligently set to work to carry out their murderous projects. A number of ceremonies and incantations were performed which entailed considerable expense, and for which it was needful to procure exotic herbs and drugs and rare instruments of poetry that could not readily be had without attracting considerable curiosity. It appeared, however, as if all their charms and spells, their demoniac Eucharists and litanies, were quite ineffective, since Urban, at 65 years of age, remained perfectly hale and hearty, and was indeed extraordinarily active in his pontificate. Young Santini became manifestly impatient, and spurred the wizards on to greater efforts. It really seems as if, vexed beyond measure and goaded to exasperation by his inopportunities, they flung all caution to the winds, whilst he himself proclaimed so magnificently what he would do for his friends in a few weeks or months after he had assumed the authority of papal nephew, that it was hardly a matter of surprise when the Holy Office suddenly descended upon the 4 accomplices and brought them to the bar. Amongst the many charges which were put forward was one of causing a statue of wax to be made of Urban VIII, in order that its dissolution might ensure that of the Pope. This in itself would have been sufficiently damning, but there were many other criminal accounts, all tending to the same end, all proven up to the hilt. The result was that Santini, Fra Pietro, and Fra Cherubino were executed in the Campo di Fiore on Sunday, the 22nd of April, 1634, whilst Fra Domenico, who was less desperately involved, was relegated for life to the galleys. These few instances I have dwelt upon in detail and at some length in order to show how constantly and continually in various countries and at various times witchcraft and magical practices were mixed up with political plots and anarchical agitation. There can be no doubt, and this is a fact which is so often not recognized, or it may be forgotten, that one cannot emphasize it too frequently, that witchcraft in its myriad aspects and myriad ramifications is a huge conspiracy against civilization. It was as such that the inquisitors knew it, and it was this which gave rise to the extensive literature on the subject, those treatises of which the Malleus Malificarum is perhaps the most known among the other writers. As early as 1600, St. Gregory had spoken in severest terms, enjoining the punishment of sorcerers and those who trafficked in black magic. It will be noted that he speaks of them as more often belonging to that class termed serui, that is to say, the very people from whom, for the most part, nihilists and Bolsheviks have sprung in modern days. Writing to Januarius, Bishop of Cagliari, the Pope says, Contra idolorum cultores, uel aruspices attaci sortielos, fratinertanem vestram uetimentius, pastorali hortamur inugliari custodia, et siquidem serui sunt, uberibus cruciat busque quibus, and emandationem periveneri uliant castigare, si urba sunt liberi, inclusione digne distracte sunt in poentiantum redigendi. But the first papal ordinance directly dealing with witchcraft may not unfairly be said to be the bull addressed in 1233 by Pope Gregory IX to the famous Conrad of Marburg, bidding him proceed against the Luciferians, who were overtly given over to Satanism. If this ardent Dominican must not strictly be considered as having introduced the Inquisition to Germany, he, at any rate, enjoyed inquisitorial methods. Generally, perhaps, he is best known as the stern and unbending spiritual director of that gentle soul, Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. Conrad of Marburg is certainly a type of the strictest and most austere judge, but it should be remembered that he spared himself no more than he spared others, that he was swayed by no fear of persons of danger of death, that even if he were inflexible and perhaps fanatical, the terrible situation with which he had to deal demanded such a man. And he was throughout supported by the supreme authority of Gregory IX. That he was harsh and unlovable is perhaps true enough, but it is more than doubtful whether a man of gentler disposition could have faced the difficulties that presented themselves on every side. Even his most prejudiced critics have never denied the singleness of his convictions and his courage. He was murdered on the highway on the 30th of July, 1233, in the pursuit of his duties. But it has been well said that it is perhaps significant that the Church has never set the seal of canonization upon his martyrdom. On the 13th of December, 1258, Pope Alexander IV issued a bull to the Franciscan inquisitors, bidding them refrain from judging any cases of witchcraft unless there was some very strong reason to suppose that heretical practice could also be amply proved. On the 10th of January, 1260, the same pontiff addressed a similar one to the Dominicans, but it is clear that by now the two things could not be disentangled. The bull Dudum ad audientium nostrum peruit of Boniface VIII deals with the charges against Walter Langston, Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, but it may be classed as individual rather than general. Several bulls were published by John the 22nd and by Benedict the 12th, both Avignon popes, and these weighty documents deal with witchcraft in the fullest detail, anathematizing all such abominations. Gregory XI, Alexander V, who ruled but 11 months, from June 1409 to May 1412, and Martin V, each put forth one bull on the subject. To Eugenius IV we owe 4 bulls which fulminate against sorcery and black magic. The first of these, 24 February 1434, is addressed from Florence to the Franciscan Inquisitor Pontius Fogrion. On the 1st of August 1451, the Dominican Inquisitor Ugo Niger received a bull from Nicholas V. Callistus III and Pius II each issued one bull denouncing the necromantic crew.